Hey guys, and welcome back. Now previously we talked about the Grub and the Grub2 bootloader, and as promised what we're now going to do is to cover some of the additional bootloaders that we can use for Linux systems. Now the first one was the original, the OG. This is Lilo or Lilo, however you happen to say it. This was the Linux loader. Now, like I say, Lilo was the OG, and it has been replaced by Grub, and since then by Grub2, so you're not really going to expect to see this anymore. But nevertheless, some of the details we do want to be aware of for the purposes of the examination. We do have a Lilo configuration file, and this will be in the location of etc lilo.conf. So this is where we could modify Lilo's behavior. And we have some similar features to what we saw before. We have a default option within that configuration file, i.e. what image should we actually boot to if the user doesn't actually enter any commands or select anything at the boot menu before the timer value expires. So we can specify the default image. We can also control how long we should wait with a timeout command. See, this is very similar to what we've talked about before. Again, if we set the value of timeout equal to 10, that would mean that we would wait for 10 seconds. We can also do things like specify the boot drive, as well as where the root file system should be loaded. So say for example in dev, SDA1. And we also have within this configuration file a label option. This is going to allow us to assign a label to this image so that it is easily identifiable, such as Ubuntu #1, say for example. So if you want to maybe say for example dual boot from your system, you maybe have an Ubuntu machine and you maybe also have a Red Hat based machine, you can use these labels to easily denote which system you're going to select. Now you may recall additional bootloaders we talked about in the LPIC 1 certification course. One is called SysLinux. This is a bootloader for Linux systems, but it runs on a Microsoft MS-DOS or Windows FAT file system. What we should be aware of is that we do have a configuration file for the SysLinux bootloader, and that is called syslinux.cfg. Now this is going to be looked for in some particular locations. The very first location that we will look for this in, or the system will look for this in, will be in the boot directory, and then the syslinux folder, and syslinux.cfg. That would be the first place the system would look. If it does not find it in that location, it would then shift. The next place we would look would just be syslinux, so forgetting the boot directory. And if we do not find it in this location, we would just look for syslinux.cfg. Now another option we have is EXT-Linux. Now originally this only supported the EXT file system type, but it now also supports things like FAT and NTFS, XFS and others. And the configuration file for EXT-Linux is quite simply going to be extlinux.conf. Next, we have the ISO Linux bootloader. This bootloader is designed specifically to make bootable CD-ROMs. This is also going to have a configuration file of isolinux.cfg. And briefly, the last one I want to talk to you about is PXE-Linux, otherwise known as Pixie Linux. Now, the main purpose of Pixie is to allow the system to be able to boot from its network card over a network. So the server that you're actually pulling this information from is going to provide you the kernel image, the init.rd, as well as the operating system. And with respect to Pixie Linux, it's going to be no surprise to you that its configuration file is called pxelinux.cfg. So these are the alternative options that we have to using Grub and Grub2. With respect to Lilo, this is pretty much an antiquated solution and not much in use anymore at all, if not really just for historical purposes. But things like SysLinux, Pixie Linux, so on and so forth, as opposed to being outdated, they have more of a specific use case. So whilst they are not quite as common as say Grub2, you certainly still might run into them even in the modern day. So that really is us for the additional bootloaders that we do have available to us. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.